Rejected Omega made the Alpha King's silent daughter smile, unaware he was watching and fighting tears. The kingdom of Urindor lay beneath a sky of perpetual twilight. Even in the middle of the day, the sun struggled to break through the thick veil of clouds that lingered like ash over the land. The castle, perched on a hill overlooking the city, was a labyrinth of gray stone and twisting towers. From its highest spires, one could see the streets below, where merchants and nobles moved like pieces on a slow, dangerous chessboard. The people of Urindor whispered of curses that clung to the royal family. Some said the king himself was haunted, a man who ruled with unmatched power yet bore a heart heavy with shadows. Others spoke of the child he had never acknowledged, a girl born to the lesser lines of the kingdom, an Omega, rejected by blood and by law. She was called Leora, though most in the city avoided even saying her name. Leora lived on the edges of the city, in the forgotten forests where moss grew thick on broken stone, and wind carried the scent of rain before it fell. She had learned early that solitude was safer than company, yet solitude was not loneliness. In the quiet, she could hear life itself, the rustle of leaves, the song of birds, and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of magic that still lingered in the old stones of Urindor. On a gray morning, Leora walked along a narrow path, her feet light against the damp earth. She carried a small basket filled with herbs, berries, and roots she had gathered for the healer who lived deeper in the woods. Her hair, dark as raven feathers, was tied loosely behind her, and her green eyes shone with quiet determination. She was aware of danger. The forests were not empty, and neither was the world beyond. But she moved with purpose, as if each step kept something dark at bay. From the palace high above, a figure watched her. The Alpha King, Kalen, stood on the balcony of the northern tower, the wind tugging at his cloak. His hair, black with streaks of silver, caught the dim light, and his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, never left Leora as she walked. He had seen her before, glimpsed her kindness toward the smallest creatures, and something in him, a part long buried, stirred. Kalen was a man who had learned to command fear as much as respect. In his court, whispers trembled on the lips of nobles who feared his sharp words and sharper justice. Yet when he watched Leora, the king felt a weight he could not name. His power, which he wore like armor, seemed suddenly heavy. He could not move closer. He dared not. And yet he could not turn away. Leora did not notice him. She paused by a small brook, crouching to let water run through her hands. A wounded fox limped nearby, its amber eyes filled with panic. She approached slowly, speaking in a voice soft enough not to scare it. "Easy, I won't hurt you." The fox hesitated, its ears twitching. Slowly, it allowed her to place a healing poultice on its leg. Leora's hands were gentle, precise. She hummed a quiet tune as she worked, unaware that the eyes watching her from above were not just any eyes. They belonged to a king who had not felt tenderness in years. A flicker of emotion crossed Kalen's face, something between sorrow and longing. He turned away from the balcony briefly, forcing himself to focus on the matters of the throne. But when he returned his gaze, the fox had fled, and Leora stood, brushing dirt from her hands, her smile small and unguarded. It was a smile that should have been insignificant, yet Kalen felt it like a strike to the chest. He did not move, he could not, and he could not stop watching. Meanwhile, Leora continued her journey. The path wound deeper into the forest, where shadows seemed to move of their own accord. She was aware of the whispers that haunted the trees, echoes of old magic, remnants of a curse placed long ago on the royal family. She did not fear them, she only respected them. Some things, she had learned, were too old and too powerful to challenge with strength alone. As she approached the healer's cabin, the door creaked open. The healer, a woman with silver hair and eyes like molten gold, greeted her. "You are early today," the healer said, her voice like the rustle of paper. "Did the forest treat you kindly?" "It always does," Leora replied softly. "As long as you listen, it tells you what you need to know." Inside, the cabin smelled of herbs, smoke, and time itself. The healer began sorting the roots and herbs, and Leora helped quietly, her mind wandering despite herself. She could feel it, the presence of eyes on her. She shook the thought away. The forest was safe. The cabin was safe. And yet somewhere, a part of her felt unsettled, as though a story she did not yet understand was beginning. Back at the palace, Kaelin walked along the halls in silence. The tapestries that lined the corridors told the history of Erendor, triumphs, betrayals, and losses, all woven into threads of gold and crimson. He stopped before a window, looking down at the city below, the rooftops glinting faintly under the gray light. And for a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to speak to her, to know her, beyond the distance that duty and fear demanded. But the shadows of the throne were not kind to those who allowed vulnerability. He had built walls of steel around his heart for a reason. To allow weakness, even for a single moment, was to invite disaster. And yet, the pull of something unseen, something unnameable, drew him toward Leora, and he hated himself for it. That evening, the air turned colder, and the forest seemed alive with whispers. Leora stayed at the healer's until the last light faded, then began the walk back toward the city. Her path was lit by the dim glow of twilight, and the trees seemed to lean closer as if sharing secrets. She felt a sudden shiver and paused. The sensation was familiar, a warning instinct she had learned to trust. Something watched her from the shadows. She whispered a small prayer, not to gods but to the world itself, asking only for guidance and safety. High above, Kaelin had followed her with his gaze until the sun dipped completely. He did not move from his tower. He could not. His hands clenched at his sides, and he struggled with emotions that had no name. Pride, fear, longing, and grief mingled within him. He had ruled with strength and silence for so long that the sudden ache in his chest was almost unbearable. As Leora reached the edge of the city, the first hints of the curse stirred. A cold wind swept through the streets, carrying whispers too faint to understand. People hurried indoors, sensing the presence of something ancient and hungry. Leora paused, glancing around, her heart beating faster. Yet she could not see it, not fully. All she could feel was the pull of destiny, subtle but undeniable. That night, Kaelin retired to his chambers, but sleep eluded him. He stared at the darkened ceiling, thinking of the Omega who had smiled without knowing he was watching. He thought of her courage, her quiet strength, and the gentle way she touched the world without leaving scars. A single thought repeated itself in his mind. She was different. She was unafraid of something he had long forgotten, the vulnerability of living fully. And somewhere in the city, Leora lay on a straw bed in a small, humble room. Her mind replayed the day's moments, the fox, the herbs, the whispering trees. A small smile touched her lips as she drifted toward sleep, unaware that eyes had followed her, silently, fiercely, from the palace towers. The wind outside carried a whisper that sounded almost like a warning. Something had awakened. Something that neither Leora nor Kaelin could yet understand. And in the stillness of the night, two hearts, one armored by power, the other by exile, were unknowingly drawn toward one another. The next morning, a heavy mist hung over Erendor. The castle towers rose like silent sentinels from the gray fog, and the streets below were empty, save for a few hurried servants. The air carried a tension that even the city's oldest walls seemed to feel. Whispers of an ancient curse drifted on the wind, and though most dismissed them as superstition, those who listened closely could sense something stirring, a force old and patient, waiting. Leora, unaware of the eyes that followed her from the palace, moved with quiet purpose. She carried a satchel filled with medicinal herbs and poultices for the healer. Her boots made soft sounds against the damp cobblestones, and the mist clung to her dark hair like a shadow. She was not afraid. Fear had been her companion once long ago, but she had learned to walk with courage instead. As she passed the main square, the first sign of danger appeared. A beggar boy, no older than 10, screamed as a black mist coiled around his feet. People hurried by, unwilling to intervene. Leora's heart beat faster, but she did not hesitate. She knelt beside him, whispering calm words and placing her hands over the black tendrils. The mist recoiled slightly at her touch, as though recognizing a strength it had not expected. The boy's tears mingled with the mist until it dissipated, leaving him unharmed. Unbeknownst to her, Kaelin had watched from the palace tower. He had seen her again, her hands glowing faintly with an unseen power as she saved the child. The sight made his chest tighten, a sensation he had not felt in years. He had ruled Erendor with precision, with iron and fear, and yet here was a girl, an Omega, shaping the world in ways he had never imagined. That evening, the palace was alive with courtly bustle. Nobles in silk and velvet whispered secrets and plotted alliances, their laughter masking the tension that never left the castle walls. Kaelin moved through the halls like a shadow, his presence commanding attention without effort. Even among the crowded rooms, his eyes sought Leora, though she remained far from his reach. Leora, meanwhile, had ventured closer to the city than usual. She delivered her herbs to a family sickened by a strange illness. The father, a man with a lined face and weary eyes, took her hand in gratitude. "You are a gift, child," he said softly. Leora smiled but did not speak. Words were unnecessary when actions carried all the meaning. As night fell, she began her walk back to the forest. The mist rose thicker, curling around the edges of buildings and lanterns, and the faint hum of magic vibrated in the air. She sensed that someone, or something, watched her, but she could not see it. She pressed on, trusting her instincts as she had always done. Kaelin, still in his tower, wrestled with a thought he could not name. He wanted to descend, to speak to her, to know her in a way that was forbidden by rank and fear. And yet he stayed, trapped by the chains of his own caution and the weight of his crown. The longing in his chest grew sharper, a quiet ache that no decree or command could erase. The next day, an unexpected message arrived at the healer's cabin. A courier, dressed in the deep green of the royal guard, handed a folded note to Leora. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The seal was the mark of the king. "You are requested at the palace," it read. "Come alone. Your skill is required." Her heart raced. The palace was not a place for someone like her. Nobles would sneer, guards would watch her every move, and Kaelin, the Alpha King, was waiting. And yet she felt a pull, a sense that her presence there was meant to be. When she arrived at the palace gates, the guards eyed her suspiciously. She held her head high, her satchel of herbs at her side, and stepped forward. A voice called from above. "You may enter," said Kaelin, standing on the balcony once more. His eyes met hers, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. She did not bow, and he did not command her to. Instead, they merely regarded each other, the silence between them charged with unspoken words. Inside the castle, the halls were colder than the forest. Shadows clung to the stone walls, twisting in shapes that seemed almost alive. Kaelin led her to the royal library, a room filled with ancient books, scrolls, and maps that smelled of dust and time. "The illness spreading through the city," he said quietly, "is unlike anything my healers have seen. It resists normal remedies. I was told you might understand it." Leora nodded, opening her satchel and arranging her herbs on the large wooden table. "It is old magic," she said softly. "Something has awakened. The mist is not just weather, it is tied to fear, to anger, to sorrow." Kaelin leaned closer, his interest piqued despite himself. "And you can stop it." "I can try," Leora replied, her fingers brushing a book bound in faded leather. "But it will not be easy. This is not just sickness. It is a shadow seeking a foothold." The king studied her, noting the calm determination in her eyes. He had never seen anyone like her, someone so small, yet so unafraid to face what others could not. In her he saw courage and kindness intertwined, and he realized that for the first time in decades, he felt something beyond fear and duty: hope. As they worked together, examining herbs and ancient scrolls, the air between them grew heavy with a tension neither could name. Kaelin wanted to speak, to ask her about the way her hands glowed with power, the way her voice could soothe not just the sick but him. Yet every word he considered remained trapped in his chest. Hours passed, and the candlelight threw long shadows across the room. Leora paused, sensing his gaze. She did not look up immediately, but she could feel the weight of his eyes, steady and intense. "You are watching me," she said quietly, almost a statement rather than an accusation. Kaelin hesitated, then nodded. "I cannot help it." She looked up at him then, meeting his eyes without fear. "Why?" she asked simply. He closed his eyes for a moment, struggling with the answer. "Because you see things I have long forgotten. You remind me that there is more to life than power." Her breath caught slightly. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not his advisors, not the nobles, not anyone in the city. She understood in that moment that he was a man divided, a king burdened with duty, yet longing for something beyond it. Before he could speak again, a sudden gust of wind burst through the open window, extinguishing some of the candles and sending papers flying across the floor. The room darkened, and the faint hum of magic grew louder. Leora's hands rose instinctively, glowing faintly as she tried to stabilize the energy. Kaelin stepped closer, his presence grounding her. "What is happening?" he asked, his voice low and steady, but his eyes betrayed concern. "It is the curse," Leora said. "It senses something or someone. It is growing stronger, and it will not wait for us to be ready." Kaelin's jaw tightened. He had faced enemies with swords and armies, yet this unseen force frightened him in a way that human threats never could. And yet, for the first time, he did not feel helpless, because Leora was here, and in her he saw not weakness but strength. They worked together through the night, poring over scrolls and herbs, whispering spells and remedies. The tension between them grew, but it was not fear or anger. It was something heavier, something charged with unspoken longing. Kaelin realized he was not merely observing her anymore. He was learning from her, being drawn into her world in a way that both terrified and exhilarated him. By dawn, the first hints of success appeared. Leora's mixture of herbs and ancient incantations had begun to push back the dark mist that had been creeping through the city. The air felt lighter, and the first weak rays of sunlight pierced the twilight sky. Kaelin leaned against the table, exhausted but filled with a strange sense of awe. You are extraordinary," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Leora shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "No, I just do what I can." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment the King and the Omega were not bound by titles or fears. They were two souls, drawn together by fate and circumstance, standing on the edge of something neither could fully understand. And then a loud knock shattered the fragile peace. The library door banged open, and a royal guard rushed in, pale and trembling. "Your Majesty," he shouted, "something is happening in the northern districts. The mist is rising faster than before, and people are disappearing." Leora's heart sank. The night's work had only been a temporary reprieve. The curse was stronger than she had imagined, and now it threatened the lives of everyone in the city. Kaelin straightened, his eyes hardening. "Then we leave nothing to chance," he said. "Prepare yourself. We must face it together." Leora nodded, gripping her satchel tightly. She did not feel fear, not yet, but she felt the weight of destiny pressing against her, the invisible threads of power and prophecy weaving her closer to the king than she could have imagined. As they stepped out into the cold morning mist, side by side, neither spoke. The world around them was quiet but alive with danger. And in the distance, a shadow moved, observing them both, waiting for the moment to strike. The northern districts of Erendor had fallen into an uneasy silence. The streets were empty except for shadows that twisted unnaturally around the lanterns and corners of the houses. The fog from the curse had returned, thicker and darker than before, curling like fingers through the alleys. People who dared to venture outside hurried with their heads down, fearing what might lurk unseen. Leora and Kaelin rode together in silence on black horses, the hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones. The wind carried a chill that cut through even Kaelin's thick cloak, but neither spoke. Their minds were focused on the darkness ahead. For Kaelin, the journey through the streets, now nearly deserted, brought an unusual tension. He had faced countless threats, rebels, invaders, assassins, but the shadows that moved as if alive were unlike anything he had ever known. And yet beside him, Leora moved with a confidence that reassured him, though he would never admit it aloud. The streets opened into a wide square where the mist swirled in unnatural patterns. Buildings appeared distorted, walls stretching and twisting as though alive. Leora dismounted first, her green eyes scanning the scene. She carried her satchel tightly, her hands resting on it as though it contained all the defenses she had learned to rely on. "The curse," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension. "It is feeding on fear. It grows stronger with every heartbeat of doubt." Kaelin dismounted beside her, his eyes sweeping over the square. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, though he knew it might be useless against this kind of magic. "Then we must face it without doubt," he said. "Together." Leora looked at him, a flicker of gratitude and relief crossing her face. "Together," she repeated. They moved into the square, stepping carefully on the cobblestones as the shadows thickened around them. The air grew heavy, pressing down on their chests, and faint whispers floated through the mist. They were voices without faces, voices of fear, anger, and sorrow. "Do you hear that?" Kaelin whispered, his hand tightening on the sword. "I do," Leora said softly. "It is trying to frighten us, to make us turn on each other. We must not listen." A shadow moved suddenly, taller than a man, with eyes like smoldering coals. Leora's hands glowed faintly as she stepped forward, chanting in a low voice that seemed to harmonize with the hum of magic in the air. The shadow recoiled, hissing like a creature in pain, but it did not vanish. Kaelin's voice rang out, steady and commanding. "You will not harm these people," he shouted. The power in his tone made the air vibrate, and the shadow froze for a moment, as if unsure of its next move. Together they fought, though it was not a fight of swords or strength. Leora wove spells with words old and precise, her hands glowing with a pale, steady light. Kaelin added his presence, his command, and his unwavering focus, his own inner energy amplifying hers. The shadows hissed and twisted, but slowly they began to dissipate. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. Leora's body trembled from exhaustion, and Kaelin's hands ached from holding his focus. And yet they pressed on, neither willing to give the darkness the slightest advantage. Finally, the square was quiet. The mist lifted, revealing the buildings as they truly were. People cautiously peeked from their homes, their eyes wide with wonder and fear. They had survived the night, thanks to the courage of a girl who had been cast out and a king who had feared his own vulnerability. Kaelin turned to Leora, his chest heaving. "You were remarkable," he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but filled with admiration. Leora shook her head, brushing hair from her face. "We were remarkable together." He looked at her then, and for the first time, the Alpha King allowed himself to feel the depth of his emotions. He saw more than her courage. He saw her compassion, her quiet strength, and the light that seemed to radiate even in the darkness. His chest ached with a longing he had never acknowledged, a desire to be more than the king, to be human again. Leora noticed the change in him too. She had felt his gaze before, but now it lingered, searching, almost fearful of what it might find. She realized that the man before her, so powerful and feared, carried a pain as deep as her own. And in that recognition, a subtle bond formed between them, stronger than magic, stronger than fear. Night fell again, but this time it was quieter, almost peaceful. They camped at the edge of the city, near the forest where Leora had grown up. A small fire burned between them, casting warm light on their faces. Kalen sat silently, staring into the flames, his mind replaying the events of the day. "You have done more than anyone could have imagined," he said finally, his voice softer than it had ever been in the presence of another. Leora smiled faintly, not meeting his eyes. "I only did what I had to." "No," he said firmly, "you did what others could not. And in doing so, you have changed me." She looked at him then, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Changed you?" "Yes," he said, his voice almost breaking. "I am not the same man I was before I saw you, before I saw your courage and your heart." For a long moment they sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Neither spoke, but the unspoken words filled the space. Fear, longing, trust, and an awareness that neither could ignore the pull between them. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the night. They both sprang to their feet, hearts pounding. The sound came from the forest, and the shadows seemed to twist even more violently than before. Leora's hands glowed, her voice chanting softly. "It is not finished," she said. "The curse, it is stronger than we thought." Kalen drew his sword, its steel catching the firelight. "Then we face it, together." They moved toward the sound, stepping into the forest where the mist clung like a living thing. Branches whipped at their faces, and the air grew colder with every step. Then from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was humanoid but taller than any man, its form twisting as if made of shadows and smoke. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and a low, rumbling voice filled the air. "You think you can stop me," it said, the words echoing in their minds as much as in the forest. "You are weak, mortal, and yet I smell your power." Leora took a deep breath, her hands glowing brighter. "We are not weak," she said firmly, "and you will not harm anyone here." The shadow hissed, recoiling slightly at the strength in her voice. Kalen stepped forward, his presence amplifying hers, his energy a solid anchor against the darkness. "Leave," he said, "or face the consequences." For a moment the shadow hesitated. Then with a scream that shook the trees, it lunged toward them. Leora raised her hands and a blinding light burst forth, pushing the darkness back. Kalen's sword flashed, cutting through the mist, though it did not strike flesh. The shadow shrieked and twisted, finally dissipating into the air like smoke blown by the wind. When the forest fell silent again, they both sank to the ground, exhausted. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, and the tension that had built between them all day hung like a fragile thread. Kalen reached out, almost instinctively, and brushed a strand of hair from Leora's face. "Are you unharmed?" he asked, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. "I am," she said, though her hands still trembled slightly. "Thanks to you." He shook his head. "No, thanks to us." They sat together in the forest for a long time, neither speaking, but both aware of the bond that had grown between them. A bond forged in fire, in shadows, and in courage. A bond that neither time nor fear could break easily. As dawn approached, they returned to the edge of the city. The first light of day revealed the destruction the curse had left behind, though much of it had been contained. People cautiously emerged from their homes, their eyes filled with awe and fear at the two who had faced the darkness and survived. Kalen looked at Leora, a mixture of admiration and longing in his gaze. "You are extraordinary," he said quietly. Leora shook her head with a small smile. "I am just a girl who refuses to give up." "But you are more," he said, his voice filled with something deeper than admiration, something that hinted at hope, at redemption, at the possibility of a life beyond shadows. And in that moment, both understood that the battle was not just against the curse. It was against their own fears, their own doubts. They had survived the night, but the journey was far from over. Their hearts were tied together by something neither fully understood, yet both could feel the strength of its pull. The first light of dawn barely touched the spires of Urindor Castle. Mist still clung to the city, curling along the streets and alleys like restless spirits. Though the curse had been held at bay for a time, its darkness lingered, stubborn and patient, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Leora and Kaelin rode swiftly through the northern districts. Their hearts were heavy with the weight of what they knew. The curse was far from defeated, and now something else was approaching, something tied to Kaelin's past. A figure had emerged from the mist, watching them with intent, someone who knew the king's weaknesses as well as his strengths. "You know them," Leora said quietly, her green eyes scanning the fog. "Who is it?" Kaelin clenched his jaw. "A man I trusted once. A friend turned enemy. His loyalty to the crown ended long ago." The words hung between them. Leora's hands tightened around her satchel, the faint glow of magic humming in response to the tension. "Then we cannot falter," she said firmly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Kaelin nodded, a silent agreement, but inside doubt gnawed at him. For years he had relied on strength, strategy, and fear to rule. Now he realized that courage alone would not defeat what was coming. He needed Leora, her heart, her insight, her power, and that fact frightened him more than any enemy ever had. As they reached the center of the northern square, the figure emerged fully from the mist. A man clad in black armor, his face hidden beneath a hood, stepped forward. A chill seemed to pour from him, thick enough to silence the wind. He held no weapon, yet the air around him felt sharp and dangerous. "Kaelin," the figure said, voice calm but carrying a weight of accusation, "you think your crown can protect this city? That your strength can save those you failed before?" Kaelin's hand went instinctively to his sword. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure lifted the hood, revealing a face Kaelin had once trusted, a friend, a comrade, someone who had shared victories and secrets. "I am your reckoning," the man said, "and this city suffers because you refuse to see your failures. Now you will pay." Leora stepped forward, placing herself slightly in front of Kaelin. "You will not harm him," she said, her hands glowing faintly. "Not while I stand here." The man laughed softly, a sound that carried over the fog. "Do you think your magic, little Omega, can stop what is inevitable? This darkness is older than you, older than your king. It cannot be fought with words or herbs." Kaelin's eyes darkened. He had faced enemies like this before, but this was different. This was a shadow of his past, a living reminder of every mistake he had ever made. And yet, as he looked at Leora standing firm beside him, he felt something stir, a courage that came not from fear or pride, but from trust. "Then we fight it," Kaelin said quietly. "Together." The figure's eyes glowed red as he raised his hands, summoning shadows that twisted like snakes around him. Leora stepped forward, chanting softly, her hands weaving light and warmth into patterns that pushed against the darkness. Kaelin joined her, his presence anchoring her magic, adding force to her spell. The shadows lunged, striking at them like living blades. Leora's light met them head-on, glowing brighter with each wave. Kaelin's voice echoed, commanding and firm, as he forced the shadows to retreat. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts, the Omega rejected by the world, wielding magic born of compassion and courage. He, the Alpha King, commanding not just armies but the very energy of his own presence. Hours passed in a battle of wills and magic. The air around them burned with power and the ground shook beneath their feet. The man in black, the living shadow of Kaelin's past, fought relentlessly, testing them at every turn. And yet, slowly, Leora and Kaelin began to push him back. At a moment of stillness, Kaelin faltered, doubt creeping into his heart. I cannot," he whispered almost to himself. "I am not enough." Leora placed a hand on his arm. "You are more than you think," she said softly. "We are more together. You do not have to face this alone." Her words were simple, yet they carried a power stronger than any spell. Kaelin drew a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, the weight of doubt was gone, replaced by a clarity he had not felt in years. He stepped forward, shoulder to shoulder with Leora, and raised his voice, commanding the full force of his presence. The shadows shrieked, recoiling at the strength of their unity. Leora's magic flared like a bright sun, piercing the fog, and the figure in black staggered, the darkness around him unraveling. Kalen seized the moment, his sword slicing through the remaining shadows, not to kill, but to break the grip of fear and anger that had animated them. Finally, silence fell. The mist lifted, revealing the city beneath a pale morning light. People emerged from their homes slowly, cautiously, their eyes wide with awe. They had witnessed not just the defeat of darkness, but the triumph of courage, trust, and unity. Kalen sank to his knees, exhausted, his sword clattering to the ground. Leora knelt beside him, her hands still glowing faintly. "It is over," she whispered. He shook his head slightly, staring at her. "No," he said, his voice low. "It is not over, not for me. You have shown me something I thought I had lost forever. You have shown me that I can be more than a king bound by fear." Leora's eyes softened. "Then you must choose," she said. "You can carry this with you or you can let it go. The choice is yours." Kalen looked at her, his heart pounding. For decades he had hidden behind his crown, behind walls of pride and authority. But now here, with the Omega who had changed him, he realized that true power was not in fear or command. It was in courage, in connection, in love. He reached for her hand and for the first time allowed himself to show vulnerability. "I choose to trust you," he said. Her hand tightened around his. "Then we face whatever comes next together," she replied. For a long moment they sat in silence, listening to the city awaken around them. The air was lighter, the shadows receding, and yet both knew that Erendor had been changed forever, not just by the curse, but by the choices they had made, by the courage they had shared. As the sun broke fully over the horizon, Kalen rose to his full height. "We must return to the palace," he said. "There is much to do, but for the first time I do not feel alone in carrying the weight of this kingdom." Leora followed, walking beside him, her steps light despite the exhaustion that weighed on her. They passed through the streets, greeted by the cautious but hopeful eyes of the people. Kalen noticed the way they watched her, the Omega who had once been cast out, and he felt a surge of respect and gratitude. She had changed not just him, but the city itself. Back at the palace, they were met with whispers and stares, but Kalen ignored them. His attention was fixed on Leora. He realized that the walls he had built around his heart were no longer needed. They had been broken not by force, but by trust, courage, and the quiet strength of someone he had never expected. That night in the quiet of his chambers, Kalen sat by the window, looking out at the city bathed in moonlight. Leora's presence was nearby, preparing remedies and herbs for those still recovering from the curse's attack. He watched her, fighting back tears he had long believed he would never shed. She was a beacon of light in his shadowed life, and he understood that he could never go back to the man he had been before meeting her. Leora glanced at him and smiled faintly, unaware of the depth of emotion he was feeling. That smile, innocent, gentle, and full of life, struck him more deeply than any battle, any crown, any command. He clenched his hands, struggling to keep the tears at bay, but they came anyway, sliding silently down his face. For once he allowed himself to be human. "You have saved more than a city," he whispered, though she did not hear. "You have saved me." And in that moment they both understood something profound. The darkness outside was defeated, but the true challenge, the journey of hearts, of trust, and of redemption, had only just begun. Together they could face it, stronger than any curse, stronger than any shadow. The kingdom slept beneath a sky of quiet stars, unaware of the bond that had formed in the midst of terror and courage. Leora and Kalen sat side by side, two souls united by destiny, trust, and the promise of a future they would face together.